Okay, so he's younger.
He just died at 79.
Yep, well, we're in our 80s. Today is Monday, December 20th, 2010. My name is Frieda Reitman, and it's my pleasure today to interview Elaine Grunberger at her home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Archive of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. The video cameraman is Julian Reitman. I have been looking forward to your story.
Thank you. I wanted to put the flowers behind me. Could you do that, Julian? Rather than all my collection of candlesticks over there. I like the flowers in the picture.
Okay?
Oh, you're going that way with it? Okay. Whatever.
Well, he will place it and make sure to put the camera so it gets it at some point.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you first about your birth family background.
Mm-hmm. My own.
Your own family,
Mhm.
right? Mother, father.
As you know, I told you that my father was brought at age 2 from the Ukraine. A place called Katerinoslav, which is no longer on the map because one of my nieces, who's into genealogy, looked it up. It's no longer there. But my grandfather, my father's father, was supposed to be a member of the Palace Guard. He was conscripted into the Cossacks, and there was a plan to initiate them all with a head on one chair, feet on another chair, and nothing in the middle. And they put a block of ice on top of their stomachs and began to use an ice pick, and if they winced, they were out. Or maybe they killed them, I don't know. But my grandfather made it. He was very cool, 6'2", with a handlebar mustache, very skinny, and a great horseman. That's why the Cossacks took him. And but he was not a religious man, and yet they kept calling him, "You Jew, you Jew, you Jew." And he finally socked his commanding officer, and he fell backward, and he ran home and picked up his wife and child and came to America. I don't know how he made it, but he did. And he came to New York and he bought a grocery store on the west side of Manhattan. And when my father was old enough, he had to deliver the milk in the morning. He was the eldest. My grandfather was very hard on my father because he was the eldest and he expected a lot from him. Eventually they bought a house in the Bronx. On my mother's side, my grandfather came in 1890 alone. He left a wife and a baby and wasn't sure he could make it, but he secretly studied coppersmithing and silversmithing with a non-Jew because he was not religious even though his father was a Reb. He was the eldest and he was a big disappointment. So he came to America in 1890 and he went back every year and they made another child, but still he kept the family there because he wasn't sure that he would have enough. And finally he brought his brothers and his cousins. One of his cousins was barber, and he taught him everything, and then Barber left and started on his own. Then they bought a house in the Bronx also. And eventually that's how my father met my mother, because my mother was playing the piano in the music room, and my father was on a blind date that my aunt had arranged, and he didn't like what she looked like. And he said, "Who's playing the piano?" And my aunt said, "Forget it, that's my kid's sister." And he walked in the other room anyway, and that was it. My mother was a very pretty blonde with a great figure, and she was a very good pianist. She was playing classical at the time. My father loved music.
Are there any childhood memories you'd like to record about your siblings, about significant people, aunts, uncles,
Oh,
where you lived?
my Uncle Barney. I found out later he was a bootlegger. They had the biggest house in Brooklyn on Avenue J. The biggest house in Brooklyn. And they had a bowling alley, they had a wine cellar, and they had a storeroom for guns. And I didn't know what it was all about. I was a kid. But they had the most magnificent seders, and we went to the seders occasionally. But he was very strict with his children. He had 3 daughters and a son. Now, this son became a very famous, was he, an ophthalmologist in Cleveland, and his daughter, beautiful girl, is married to Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg's son. Isn't that something?
Yes.
Anyway, but I've got a lot of famous people in the family, mostly women.
Okay. What about siblings?
My brother just died in February. No, in July. Mother died in February. He was 79, he was a lawyer, he was brilliant, and he studied at the University of Arizona. My father had wanted him to study law, but he said no, he wanted to be a musician. He went to Drake University and studied music. And then Korean War broke out, and he enlisted in the Marines. And I and my father went downtown and got him out of that. I don't know how my father did it. So then he enlisted in the Air Force, and we decided to let him be there. He enlisted in the Air Force, and he was sent to San Antonio, Texas, and he developed a terrible thing. Somebody used his towel, and his eyes were affected by it. My uncle saved his life by sending down penicillin or something. And then he came back, and he finished college, and then he went to law school, the University of Arizona. And he married a wonderful girl named Helen, who's like my other sister. And we call each other several times a week. She's in Sarasota for a month. She invited me down, but I don't think I go because I think Florida's boring. But my sister studied psychology. She married much too early against my father's wishes. And it was not a happy marriage, but she bore 3 children, 3 marvelous children. One girl is a lawyer in Iowa, and the other girl is a very famous oncologist up in Hartford. And if my daughter had come east, maybe my niece could have saved her. Actually, mammograms didn't work then. Sonograms are more effective now. And my brother's children are Tia, the filmmaker who was nominated for the Oscar, but the man who crossed the wires in 1973, World Trade Center, he's the one who won the Oscar, where she had spent 3 years of her life going back and forth to New Orleans, but at least she was nominated. It was a great honor. And Helen went out there. My brother could not make it. He was not well. And the other girl is a musician, and she lives in Kensington, Maryland, and she has a getaway place in West Virginia in the mountains. It's beautiful there.
Know that area.
And she brought up her son almost by herself. She was divorced early in the marriage because he wanted her to give up her musical career and follow him to Chicago. He was a physicist, very smart, Princeton, Columbia undergraduate. He had a PhD from Princeton in physics, and he was in the nuclear industry, I think. And he decided to become a stockbroker and go to Chicago, where he had a great opportunity, and she would not go with him because she had a contract with Hilton, she had an agent to pay, and she plays piano and composes her own stuff and also plays other stuff. Anyway, she brought up Derek almost single-handed, and Derek's a fine kid. He's 1 year younger than my grandsons, and that's Liz. And then there's Michael, who works for Xerox and has a marvelous wife whom, when he married her, knew she had muscular dystrophy. It's in her family. He married her anyway because he loved her so much. And against doctors' wishes, they had a child, a beautiful girl named Charlotte, who plays several musical instruments, and she's in the Washington Children's Choir, and she's just fabulous.
Wow.
So that's my brother's 3 children. I think I told you my sister's 3 children.
Yes.
Did I tell you about? Peter is a paralegal. His sister was a lawyer, his sister was a doctor, but Peter has diabetes. When he was born at McGee Hospital in Pittsburgh, he developed a cardiac virus, and his immune system went down. And they discovered diabetes when he was very young. So he gives himself insulin every day, and he's a paralegal, lives alone, volunteers at the neighborhood playhouse, and he's a very good kid.
Let's talk a little more about you. You didn't tell us anything about your education.
Oh, my education. Well, I was born at Dr. Kramer Sanitarium in the Bronx on the Grand Concourse, and where did we live then? I think my parents had an apartment on Bedford Park Boulevard. Then I went to public school. Oh, one of the people I went to public school with was Stanley Kubrick. He was in my class. And we both wrote for the little newspaper. Then I went to junior high school, an all-girls junior high school, Elizabeth Barrett Browning Junior High School. I had a teacher named Miss Young, who wore black all the time, and pantaloons under her black, because one day she adjusted her garters, pulled up her skirt, and we saw them. After that, I didn't want to go to Hunter College like my aunt did. I didn't want to go to Barnard, where my father had gone to Columbia for undergraduate work. I didn't want to go to Barnard because it was segregated then. So I went to NYU, which was girls and boys. And I majored in English. I was on the dean's list a lot, and I worked pretty hard. My mother helped me type my papers. She was wonderful at that, because my mother, after high school, had gone to the Eastman Gaines Business School, and she was a very good typist. As a matter of fact, she helped my father sometimes when he brought home stuff when his secretary was sick or something. After NYU, I worked summers, and my father didn't like that. He was very much in control. So he'd come down and embarrass me at my job and make me spend my money. I was working at the learner shops, and he made me quit and spend my money right there and not go back, because he said, "Didn't I give you enough allowance?" He was like that. Anyway, at NYU in my third year, I was studying constitutional law. I was the only undergraduate in the class. I got an A. And my professor said, "You're a natural for the law school. We're building it down here Georgian style at the square." And I went home with stars in my eyes, and my father said, "Nothing doing. Law is tough enough. You're a girl. You're too nervous. You'll never get married because you're fussy already." And that was the end of my aspiration to law school. I didn't have the gumption. I mean, you couldn't get a job and work in law school in 1947. That's when I was a junior. So I graduated at age 20 and a half at NYU in 48. And I went to work as then I went to business school because I didn't type properly and I didn't know any shorthand. I went to business school and finished the course in 3 months instead of a year. And I went to work as a secretary in a nonprofit organization on East 64th Street. I picked it because of the office. It was a brownstone. It belonged to the Church Peace Union. We had an elevator, and we were very nice people. And my office was on the top floor, and I could look out. Gypsy Rose Lee's house was over there, and somebody else's house was there. And it was all beautiful gardens. Then the two professors I worked with, Dr. Clyde Miller and Dr. Robert Norton, they left or retired or something. Clyde Miller was the one who wrote the paper on propaganda analysis, and I helped him a little bit with it. I edited some of it. He was from the Midwest, and he was a brilliant man, very bombastic, and he was a Methodist and a real lefty, not just liberal, but he was really left of left. And I learned a lot from him, and I learned a lot from the people who walked into my offices whose engagements I booked. Their hotels, their trains, their buses, there were not much flying in those days, and their honorariums. I had to write all the letters and arrange for it. Then I went to work on the Eisenhower campaign, believe it or not, with a man who was a very staunch Republican, but Jewish. And he was the treasurer of my nonprofit lecture bureau. And I went to work in his office in the Waldorf Astoria, and his niece became my best friend, Lisa Lott. And she and I would go out to lunch together, or she was from Germany, from mites. And occasionally she'd bring in knockwurst and we'd boil it right there and eat it for lunch. It was wonderful. And eventually Lisa got married to a dentist from in Minnesota. And she moved out there. And several years we talked to each other, but I don't know where she is now. Lisa Lott had skied over the mountains to get away from Hitler with her family. And they came to this country practically penniless. And this treasurer that I worked for, he sponsored them. And she had no children. And
Well, you had quite a life there in New York. I wanted to ask you about your time in New York. Did you ever encounter anti-Semitism?
in New York,
Yeah, in New York.
I don't remember. Isn't that strange?
No, I think that probably means it didn't. If you did, it was very minor,
Yes, yes.
because I think otherwise you would remember it, so.
I know my father did when he was growing up. I mean, when they had that grocery store on the Lower West Side, he had to fight his way to school. They called him "you dirty sheeny," and he told us all about it.
Okay, so you would remember if you had been subjected to that, I
Yeah.
think.
Right. And
That
in
was
public
his
school,
generation.
we were mostly Jewish, or a few Irish thrown in. There were no blacks at all in the Bronx. We had a house on Davidson Avenue. Congressman Buckley lived across the way diagonally. Never saw him. I don't think he was related to Buckley, who lived in Stamford. He represented the Bronx. But I went back recently to see that house on the corner that we had.
Okay,
And they pulled out the sun power and they put another bedroom in. They extended the house onto the sidewalk. And the trees were wrapped up with metal fences. It was completely different. I shouldn't have gone back. It was a big disappointment. Everything changes though.
that's true. So, when did you come to Stamford? I want to bring you now into your family.
When I married David. And
How did you meet him?
How did I meet him? Jenny Grossinger's husband, her husband's name was Grossinger, had a it was a cousin, I guess. I think her name was Carla, I'm not sure. She was a social hostess at Grossinger's. My parents used to go to Grossinger's on a fast weekend and leave us home because there was no place for children. Anyway, my friend Sally, with whom I'd gone to Europe I'd gone for 2 months, and I stayed for 5 because I had a friend who was in Zurich. Her husband was at medical school. She said, "I'm making a reservation for you at Grossinger's, because you look down in the dumps." I'd broken up with a friend of mine from college. I said goodbye to him before I went to Europe. And he didn't take no for an answer, but he finally did. Anyway, Sally said, "I put $50 down for you." And I said, "My father doesn't want me to go." And I listened to my father in those days. And she said, "Well, you owe me $50. I said, "No, I'll go." In 1951, it was a lot. So I went with her up there, and I don't think I went for dinner. I had worked that day, that Friday, and then we went up there. And this little woman came up to me and said, "What's your name?" And I said, "Why?" I didn't know what she wanted. And she said, "What's your name?" I said, "Elaine." And this guy was behind me, looking the other way at probably some blonde. And she turned him around and said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name is David." And that's how we met. Elaine meet David at Grossinger's. I wrote them a thank you note when we were engaged to be married. And they sent a lovely little silver tray. Then we took the children up there after that for a couple of weekends. It was very nice.
Well, tell us about the children.
Oh, the children. I had my daughter 1 year, people are counting on their fingers, 1 year after we were married. We were married November 1st and she was born September 15th. It was less than a year, but still within the proper time. My husband had said, let's try the Catholic method. It didn't work. And then she was adorable. She was like a little oriental doll. She had the higher cheekbones and the eyes, the Hungarian eyes that my husband had come from Hungarian parents. And the nurses didn't want to let her go. She was really something. And she was a very good child. And I tried to nurse her, and I ate a piece of chocolate and gave her diarrhea. So the nurse gave me a guilt complex, and I stopped nursing, and then I got rocks in my breast, and I was in pain, more pain than childbirth, and the childbirth was painful, for many, many weeks. The doctor didn't give me anything. Then I wanted another child, and I had trouble, so I had some small surgery, and then I became pregnant 2 weeks later with my son. And he is what I have today. He's a marvelous philanthropic doer. He's a workaholic like his father was, but even more so. And he comes with me to important medical appointments. He insists on coming. And they follow the family tradition. My husband went to Brown University, my daughter went to Brown, and my son went to Brown. And there's a guy who's an architect in New Canaan. He had 4 children. He and his wife both went to Brown, and none of his 4 got in there. And he was insanely angry at us. We couldn't do anything about it.
So you had 2 children in Stanford,
Yes.
and they went to Stanford schools?
They went to Stanford High like their father did. They followed the whole family tradition, Stanford High, Brown University. And my daughter stayed in Providence because she loved Providence so much. And my husband said, that's like her womb. Her friends are there and don't expect her to come back. Whereas my son came back very quickly. He occupied the bedroom and bath upstairs for a while. But then girls began knocking on the door at 10 o'clock at night looking for him.
Oh dear.
So my husband said, I'm going to have to get you an apartment, Jim.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what do we do now?
Your children went to school in
Stanford.
Stanford.
The public schools,
The
I
public
believe in public
schools.
schools, absolutely, so did my father.
Did they have any problems with anti-Semitism in the school system?
My daughter, at one point, one of her best friends, who ultimately became a Rhodes Scholar, said something nasty about Jews, and she punched him. And she didn't talk to him for a couple of months. He finally apologized. His father was a doctor, not a doctor in the zero population in Washington, D.C., that kind of group. He didn't practice medicine. They were very bright parents, and the kid was very bright and very nice, actually. But this is something he heard. I don't think he heard it at home. And she was very outraged by it. I don't know whether my son had friends of both kinds. Eddie McGrath was his best friend. They were Catholic. My husband's friends were both kinds. My husband eased out because he was the one selected for Brown. His best friend was not. His best friend got into UP, but he didn't talk to my husband after that. His best friend was Jewish. But I'm sure my husband had, oh yes, he did. Come to think of it, my husband said he had something going on in Stanford where he hit somebody on the arm and he broke his arm because he called him a dirty Jew. And that was way back. But,
would you like to talk at all about your relations in the Jewish community? I know you've told me some things about Bethel and Rabbi Perlman.
Rabbi Perlman asked me, and I didn't want to turn him down, and I set up the children's library at Bethel. Spent 2 summers doing it. I'm not going to put this on the tape, but Norma Mann helped me. Very few other people did. And I had a crew of some teenagers who helped me with the typing. I went to the library and Marie Hurley would not help me. She said we had enough stuff there. I went to the First Congregational Church, and Isabel Bailey was wonderful. She said, "You study the Dewey Decimal System?" I said, "Yes, I knew it from high school." She said, "We can adopt your own and set it up that way." I bought the tables and chairs. I bought the bookcases from the Darien Library. They were solid wood, mahogany, walnut, you name it. It was not plywood. And the Epsteins were wonderful. They arranged trucks to bring them to Stanford. They had to take them apart and put them together again. And there was the old temple on Prospect Street. And I spent 2 summers there where my children were upstairs in the classroom studying the Bible, and I was a dutiful library mother. And what else did I do? So I studied, while my children were studying, I joined a Bible study group because I'd never been exposed to that. And Sylvia Jacobs was the coordinator. And I found myself objecting to a lot of matters of faith, like there's somebody rising from heaven and so on and so forth. And she said, "You have to take it on faith." And so I questioned a lot. Then I joined a Brandeis University study group. No, we had our own study group, and then we joined the Brandeis University study group. And somebody put me on the board, and suddenly I was vice president, and the person who was ahead of me didn't want to be president. She said she went to Smith and she didn't want to be president of a Brandeis group. I said, "Well, I went to NYU, but that's all right with me." And I turned it down twice, and my sister-in-law, Louise, who was very active in a lot of stuff, Westport Playhouse and Cabot Lodge's governor's wife was a friend of hers, whatever. I became president of Brandeis for 2 years. And I really enjoyed the 2 years, and we opened the Larry Aldridge Museum. It was a fundraiser and so on and so forth. But I got calls at 10 o'clock at night, and my husband was very annoyed. He liked the fact that I had my picture in the paper all the time, but he was very annoyed about that. What else did I do?
Well, what about the Governor Grasso appointment?
Oh, yes. Well, Mary Mashinsky came from Wallingford, and she was a state representative. And she was at our house visiting me, and snow began to fall, and we wouldn't let her go back driving in a very small car that she had. She stayed over, and she became a friend of the family. And she suggested that my name be put in because there was a vacancy as a consumer advocate on the Milk Regulation Board of the Department of Agriculture. And all of a sudden, I was on it. I had to go to the State Assembly to be approved, and I remember Goldmark was there at the same time. And I was approved of, and I stayed on that Milk Regulation Board as a consumer advocate, fighting for equality in that I didn't want anything but English on the milk cartons. I wanted nothing that would give one producer an advantage over another. And I was anxious about the pricing, which came out of Boston. That was the area. Anyway, Weicker became governor, and he suddenly approved of giving hormones to cows. And I disapproved. I really ranted about it. And the only one who supported me was another woman on the board who was a goat farmer. She and I were against it, but the others voted for it, including Alexander Gaida, who still has a lot of milk, but he's not a farmer anymore. He's a head of a big co-op. So I got off that board. I did not apply to be, after 9.5 years, driving up to Hartford and all that business. I enjoyed it, but that was the last straw. Yeah, and Grasso, I went to one of Grasso's fundraisers upstate a bit, and I was in such a hurry to get there. I locked my keys in the car, and one of Grasso's people, a state trooper, inched his way in and got my car open without even disturbing anything. It was very strange, and it was very nice. She was a marvelous woman. She died early of ovarian cancer. So did my sister-in-law. That's where the gene came from. My husband's sister, who also went to Pembroke, she died of ovarian cancer. She was a school teacher in Stanford High. She taught political science. And she leaves 2 children, George, who's a dentist in Tucson, I think he's about to be retired now. He was a head swimmer at Ripwam High School. And Lynn, who brought up 2 girls herself, she was divorced. And I helped her with her psych tests so she could finish college. And she lives in Norwalk. Lynn, she took back her maiden name, Mantell.
I know your husband died in 1983,
Yes.
and
Suddenly, in my son's arms on Atlantic Street, they were building the mall and the ambulance could not get through. And he was hesitating, and my son came in a different car. They both parked in the Bill Street lot. And Jimmy ran over to him, "What's wrong, Dad, what's wrong?" And he fell down on the sidewalk. He was wearing a very heavy overcoat. Police took a long time to come. They ripped open his coat, but it was too late. And my mother called me. My mother was told. She lived in Stanford by that time. Elaine, come to Stanford Hospital. David's there. I said, "What's wrong?" I was at a meeting in Darien. And she said, "Just come to Stanford Hospital." When I got there, he was all laid out with a sheet over him. And I screamed and I cried. I couldn't believe it. And all of a sudden a nurse came and yanked me up and said, "We can't do that here. There's a place for that." I was shocked beyond belief. And there was my mother and my son in another room. And my daughter was coming down from Massachusetts. She was in a PhD program in clinical psych, even though she was a poet. My husband said, "You have to earn a living." So after Brown, she was president of class for 10 years, by the way, at Brown. She got into UMass, and she came down. Somebody drove her.
Do you want to talk about, I know, about his family? I know that he was born in Stanford,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And they have the business, which is part,
It's very
an
important,
part of
actually.
Stanford business history.
Well, I'll tell you how.
Did you work in the store at all?
Yes, finally, when the children were in college, I worked there on Fridays, but I wasn't paid. And it was really funny. I must tell you about the early history, though. George Grunberger, his father, came to New York early on by himself as a very young man. And he became an ophthalmologist, not an ophthalmologist, an optician. He ground lenses and he also fixed watches. He was a jeweler. In New York, he had both professions. He was a very hard worker, very handsome young man with dark hair and blue eyes. And he met this woman who worked in a jeweler 5 blocks away, and her name was Greenberger, Rose Greenberger. And eventually they got married and they had a child, and the child died at age 6 months of a congenital hernia that was in her family. All the firstborn sons in her family died of congenital hernias. In those days, 1900s something, they didn't know what it was. What happened was he was in pain, he writhed, and the carriage turned over on him. And she felt guilty. She felt that she caused it because she left him in the carriage for a minute. And it wasn't that. She ran to Scranton, Pennsylvania. He ran after her. Scranton's where one of his sisters lived. He ran after her and said, "We'll leave New York." So he bought a train ticket to Bridgeport, where they knew a lot of Hungarians were there. But he didn't go to Bridgeport that day. He got off in Stanford because he liked the way it looked. Looked like his hometown then. This was 1908. And he got off and he got a job right there as a jeweler in 1908. 3 years later, and he brought his wife with him, and they lived on St. John's Place, which is no longer there. It was a rented something or other, multifamily, I think. 1911, the guy he was working for asked him to climb to the top of the town hall steeple and fix the clock, and it was sleeting, and it was a big wind. He said, I quit. If I'm going to risk my neck, I'm going to do it for myself. So he stayed. 1911, he opened his own store, which is why now my son will be celebrating 100th anniversary of Grunberger Jewelers.
And so the son took over, so the father stayed, that was the place, and he stayed in that business in Stamford.
He stayed in that business
And
in
your
Stamford,
son
and
took it
people
over.
loved him. And my husband took it over when he finished Brown. And then my son took it over when my husband died. But if he made any mistakes, my husband did not correct him. He said he had to learn with it by doing. My husband never fired anybody unless it was really flagrant. But Grunberger's, the way my father-in-law worked, if a guy needed to get married and didn't have money for a ring, he gave it to him. And he said, when you get a job or whatever, you can pay me back, don't worry about it. And that's the way he was. He cared about people. And my husband was the same way. And Jim is the same way too. But he doesn't give away rings anymore, I hope not. But everybody loves him. I mean, people come in from other states and say, I'm sorry to hear about your father, you know, and my son, this is one after he died, and he began to cry. And it's like an institution in Stamford. And my son moved to Bull's Head from Atlantic Street when they took away the parking, and people came in asking for bus fare and so on and so forth. So he moved to Bull's Head, was probably the best thing he did. But he hires a policeman for the, and he pays it out of his own pocket.
Are there any leisure activities you want to talk about, getting back to you? Any travel?
Before I do that, I want to tell you what my son's leisure activities are. There's a pamphlet around. He started the East Side Partnership. He cleaned up the East Side. He took the automobile dealers off the streets. They were parked on the sidewalks. It was not a neighborhood that people cared about. And it was an approach from Darien to Stamford. And he, in his own pocket, he landscaped it. He put in trees, flowers, and bushes. And he got a lot of people on his side. And he's fully rented over there. This is a property that I gave up. I gave up a lot of property when my husband died because I was hit with a lot of estate taxes. We didn't know that the property was worth so much when he died. So I gave most of it up except for one little place on High Ridge Road where Camera Wholesalers is. I have 52% and Jimmy has 48%. That's the only thing that we have in common. Otherwise, I have my own investments and I look after myself. Really.
Why not? You're a new woman, perhaps a little ahead of your time, but not unlike women coming of age now, so.
And I was so glad we built this ranch house. But recently I had new stairs put in to the basement, to the garage, so I could, with my hip, my arthritic hip, I could walk without assistance.
Was there anything about travel you'd like? Have you ever been in Israel?
Yes, David and I were in the south of France and he was bored stiff. He got bored very easily because, as I said, he was a workaholic. He said, let's go to Israel. Maybe I can buy some diamonds and take my part of the trip off. He couldn't take my part off. And so we flew to Tel Aviv, and I took the public buses around, and I was shocked to see that the veterans of the wars in Israel were given jobs as bus drivers. And they rounded corners, and people were holding on, fell over, and the drivers laughed. That was rather strange. Tel Aviv was it was July, it was a very hot city. Then we went to Jerusalem, which was lovely. But then this man followed us around and wanted to know why, as American Jews, we were not living there and supporting them instead of staying in America.
What year was this?
About? It was right after the October War. Because I met my niece, she was studying at the University of Jerusalem, and we were at the airport. And she was coming back from Jerusalem, and we were going to Paris. Yeah, it was about 78? Yeah.
Would you like to have any final reflections about living in Stamford, about the Jewish community, about anything else that's on your mind? Which is, as we can see, is a pretty impressive line.
The Jewish community, to me, I've had very good friends in it. I still have very good friends. Some of them have gone to Florida and some of them have died. But my friends in this community have been of all kinds. I don't like to limit myself. Neither did my husband. It narrows your scope. That's why I sent my children to the public schools. My father taught us that. I mean, his clients were of all kinds. I think we live in a multicultural society, getting even more so, and more mixed, and you just have to keep an open mind.
That's a wonderful thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for your work in this field. It's very dedicated of you.